and welcome back to the 35th ASEAN Roundtable crisis and its impact on ASEAN and the way forward. I am Tham, Yean, and I will be moderating today's session on the economic impact of the COVID pandemic on ASEAN's economies, the way forward to sustain open trade policies, prospects of supply chain reconfiguration, and opportunities to leverage on the existing regional agreements and the prospective regional comprehensive economic partnership to strengthen ASEAN's economic integration. The pandemic, as we know, has pushed ASEAN's economies into a lockdown to help contain the virus and save lives. Unfortunately, it has also affected livelihoods and has worsened the economic performance of all the countries in the short run. The economic slowdown has been further exacerbated by temporary trade restrictions due to the concerns over domestic shortages of food and critical medical supplies. However, on the positive side, the pandemic reinforced the trend of firm relocations from China to other countries, which presents an opportunity for ASEAN to reposition itself in global supply chains. Such opportunities for ASEAN can be further supported by the implementation of the RCEP to lower trade costs and provide deeper common disciplines that facilitate the operation of economic activities spanning multiple borders. For today's session, we have with us three distinguished panelists. First, Ms. Selena Ling, Chief Economist of OCBC Bank. Second, we have Dr. Menon, Visiting Senior Fellow, ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute. And last but not least, Tan Sri Dr. Munir Majid, Chairman, CIMB ASEAN Research Institute, or CHARI. Without much further ado, may I now call upon Ms. Selena to share her thoughts on the economic impact of COVID-19 on ASEAN. Over to you, Ms. Ling.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the COVID crisis has actually impacted the ASEAN economies. Let me take a first step by highlighting to you the number of cases that ASEAN has actually seen. We can see from the chart on the left that actually the ASEAN COVID-19 cases has climbed quite rapidly in recent weeks and months. But nevertheless, if you compare that to as a percentage of the global case count, we only account for about 2%. So it's still relatively contained if you look on a global basis. And the chart on the right, you can see where ASEAN is, which is the red bar, effectively compared to some of the larger economies, US, India, Brazil, okay, we are still a small fraction. But nevertheless, there are some concerns that the recent uptick that we have seen, whether you call it a second wave or third wave, it has contributed to partial lockdown stories again. And this is true for parts of Indonesia and also Malaysia. So if you look within ASEAN itself, who has the highest concentration of COVID-19 cases? It will be Philippines, Indonesia, and Singapore comes third. What's quite interesting is that Vietnam has very small fraction of the total COVID cases so far. Even though on the population count, they are about 15%, but as a fraction of the COVID cases, it's only 0.1%. And it's also quite encouraging, actually, if you look at the death rates, it's still relatively low. It's only about 16 per million. And the chart on the right, actually, you can see the percentage of the patients who have recovered in Singapore is very high. That said, actually, the economic toll on ASEAN is not unique. Like the rest of the world, we are going to see a likely full-year recession across most of the ASEAN economies. I think what is notable within Asia itself is that China is one of the few major economies that will see positive growth, and Vietnam will also still see a marginal growth of 1.6%, even though that is a very big step down from the 7% growth that they saw last year. In terms of our estimates, and this coincides with the IMF estimates as well, which you can see on the chart on the left, essentially it will take at least a year, we think, for Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia to recover to its pre-pandemic GDP levels. And Singapore, Thailand, and Philippines may actually take slightly longer, but we think that probably by 2022, we'll be back at the pre-COVID levels as well. So the recovery is going to be slightly more prolonged compared to the SARS period that we saw back in 2003. If you look at the IMF revised forecast, I've highlighted the ASEAN 5 GDP growth for 2020 and 2021 in blue. You can see that they have actually revised down the 2020 growth forecast compared to their June forecast. But nevertheless, if you compare to the other emerging countries, whether it's EM, Europe, Latin America, or even Middle East and Central Asia, actually the contraction in the ASEAN 5 economies this year looks like it's relatively milder. And then if you look forward to 2021, the recovery story, actually it looks like ASEAN 5 will also see a stronger bounce back in terms of the 2021 recovery. So what is underpinning some of this bounce back, apart from all the monetary and fiscal support that has come on stream, really is the chart on the left, which shows the FX sentiment index. You can see that since March, actually there has been a strong recovery in risk appetite. And to some extent that is driving both portfolio flows back into the region. And I think for a lot of companies that are looking slightly longer term, they are also looking at the attractiveness of ASEAN as a market. And I'll talk a little bit about that down the road. So let me just take stock of the unprecedented fiscal and monetary policy stimulus that has been put in place. This is a very short summary of all the fiscal stimulus plans that have been announced this year. As you can see, Singapore and Malaysia is relatively high, closer to 20% of GDP, and then it kind of scales down to around the 4 to 5%. Nevertheless, these amounts actually far outstrips the kind of fiscal aid that we have put in place during the GFC or even during the Asian financial crisis. And I think what is quite interesting about the fiscal stimulus is that actually there has been a lot of payments and wage support, job support schemes that will go out to helping both the workers and also the low-income households. So I think in terms of the fiscal net, the approach has been that you really need fiscal stimulus to complement the monetary policy rate cuts that we have seen year to date. And I think the likelihood is that for policy makers to attempt to continue to extend some of this support going out in 2021 itself, given the very long tail nature of the COVID-19 crisis. This table summarizes the key monetary policies support that has been announced this year to tackle the COVID-19 fallout. And as you can see, actually across the region, there has been very significant interest rate cuts. We are not quite at the zero bound yet, unlike some of the G3 economies, but nevertheless, I think the sense is that from here, there probably has to be a lot more caution about where we want to bring rates to. I think unlike what we see the discussion going on in some of the G7 economies, I don't think that Asian policymakers are ready to wade into the negative rate territory yet. But nevertheless, in terms of the support as well, just like fiscal stimulus, we have seen that beyond the usual interest rate cuts, actually there has been an extension of a lot of assistance, whether it's in the form of loan moratoriums, helping the repayments for a lot of the corporates, extension of dollar liquidity, extension of onshore funding as well, making sure that financing conditions remain ample during this period in time. Singapore also has adopted a neutral slope for the Sing-Near band. What this means is that effectively there will be no appreciation in the trade-weighted Sing dollar in the near term. And in the recent MPS statement by the MAS, I think they have reiterated that they are very comfortable with the current stance and there will be no change from here, at least out till the next policy meeting in April of 2021. So that brings me to my point. If you look at the PMI numbers, which is the two charts below, it does suggest that at least for the Purchasing Managers Index for the last couple of months, we are seeing somewhat like a V-shaped recovery, okay? But I think the truth will probably emerge only in the fourth quarter and probably in the first quarter of next year. The reason why I say that is that some of these PMI numbers, as you can see on the right side of the charts, effectively they have started to waver a little bit. So it's not a clear V-shaped rebound from here, okay? I I think there are a couple of things that are weighing on people's mind. One is that US-China trade tensions have not gone away. Secondly, of course, with the upcoming US elections, there's a fair bit of uncertainty about how that's going to play out and what it means for the approach to globalization and free trade and also China in the coming years. And I think last but not least, we also see that COVID-19 has a very long tail. Subsequent resurgence of infections suggests that there will continue to be localized lockdowns and retightening of some of the social distancing measures. And this will take a toll, I think not so much on the manufacturing sector, but probably more on the domestic demand and the services sector. I think in particular, the hardest hit were the aviation and tourism related industries, and this will have a very challenging road for the years ahead. If you look at IATA, basically they don't expect the global passenger traffic to recover until at least 2024. Although we have had news about some green lanes and travel bubbles being reopened, nevertheless, I think it's a very, very cautious and gradual approach. I think the situation is very fluid. We may actually continue to see tightening again, as and when we see cases pick up again as well. So the chart on the right actually is quite interesting. It tells you, gives you a sense of which are the hardest hit industries and which ones are faring a little bit better. It's not a surprise that anything to do with travel and aviation and discretionary spending will actually be more impacted by the pandemic, whereas things like pharmaceuticals and your essentials like food and beverage, for instance, and your medical devices, and actually semiconductors are not doing that badly, or they are relatively more immune. We have seen an uptick, I think in particular in the semiconductor industry, and that's driving some of the recovery in the manufacturing PMIs. And that's largely due to the fact that because of COVID and the lockdown story, a lot of people are working from home. That means more requirements for hardware and equipment and also cloud computing services. And I think companies are also increasingly moving online. So retail has shifted online as well. And consumers and workers are now a lot more comfortable with online platforms to do their normal shopping and even to play and entertain and to work as well. So I hinted earlier that we saw a V-shaped recovery in the third quarter, but fourth quarter looks like it's going to waver a little bit. And these are some high frequency economic indicators that we look at. For instance, if you look at mobility trends across ASEAN, you can see that it peaked around July when all the economies basically started reopening. But since then, actually, it's come off a little bit. And this is really because of the localized lockdowns and retightening of measures that we are seeing in pockets of ASEAN. This is a similar story if you look at air pollutant levels. This is a reflection of the resumption of business activity and factory operations. Again, that peaked around June or July, and since then it's kind of like hovering in that range. So what this suggests is that actually the ongoing economic recovery path probably is going to be a little bit uneven. And then if you look in terms of financial markets, which is the chart on the right, in terms of equity and bond portfolio inflows into ASEAN. Year to date, you can see that actually is a net negative. Basically, there has been net outflows, and it's been the worst outflow compared to at least 2012, okay? So I would say that basically we are not out of the woods yet. The silver lining really is this, okay? At the end of the day, we can have very severe recession GDP numbers, but how does that impact the labor market and what does it mean for the men on the street? So we look at unemployment rate, for instance. If you look at the current 2020 forecasted unemployment rates across ASEAN, they are obviously sharply higher than the preceding years in 2018 and 2019. They probably have not peaked yet. They may only peak in 2021 itself, but nevertheless, it gives you a gauge as to the fallout in terms of the labor market. So if you compare to earlier crises, whether it's the Asian financial crisis or SARS or GFC, growth numbers look like it's a lot worse than the GFC and SARS, okay? In terms of the unemployment rate, I will say this, is that actually we've had very early and heavy government intervention, like I highlighted in the table on fiscal stimulus. There is a lot of support financial support that is going to the labor market, helping whether it's with job wage subsidies or helping with employment. And that's really capping the increase in the unemployment rate. So while the World Bank has forecasted that there will be a sharp surge in terms of the global unemployment due to the COVID crisis, as you can see from the blue and orange bars on the right chart, that is very severe. But for now, it looks like it's not really showing up that much in some of the Asian countries as yet. So what are the silver linings? I talked about the labor market, but let me just flesh out a couple for you. One is that actually financial markets risk sentiments have recovered quite a fair bit since the March lows. A lot of that was predicated on central banks and policymakers throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, at the problem. So risk recovery has actually preceded the growth recovery that we're starting to see from the second half of this year. ASEAN looks like it's faring slightly better than some of the other EM blocks. Okay. COVID-19 has been a bit of a double-edged sword, but what we have seen is that US-China tensions that started way back in 2018 have prompted a lot of companies to adopt a China plus one approach. They were trying to reduce their over-reliance on China as factory of the world. So Vietnam has benefited from this. But going forward, it's not so straightforward because even Vietnam is starting to see the currency manipulation tech coming in from the US, so that loophole may be closing. But I think ASEAN really has more to offer than that. Okay. I think COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the need for regionalization and nearshoring, and also accelerated digitalization and automation, and also highlighted the need for continued regional economic integration. So the two charts below is just to show you a couple of things. The chart on the left, it tells you that ASEAN is still a preferred choice for relocation within Asia-Pac ex-Japan, okay? And then the chart on the right, it just shows you that actually China has benefited a lot from the diversion of trade flows away from China, and in terms of Vietnam's exports to the US, for instance. Okay. The other point really is that ASEAN actually benefits from China's first in, first out recovery story. Okay, you can see on the chart on the left, actually ASEAN now has overtaken the EU as one of the top trading partners for China. Okay, so if China recovers faster than the rest of the world, ASEAN will benefit because our economic linkages have actually intensified. Right? Look at the middle chart, which is China's machinery exports to ASEAN last year. I think that diversification story that I mentioned for China plus one is already happening. We were seeing large machinery exports in, which is kind of like a leading indicator to setting up factory operations and manufacturing plants in some of these ASEAN markets. And then if you look in terms of the stock of direct investments in ASEAN, that has actually grown tenfold over the last decade. Manufacturing in particular has been the largest sector receiving most of these flows. COVID-19 has taken a huge toll, not just on economies, but also on consumers and businesses, right? China's position at the heart of these global value chains have been upended to a certain extent, and I think Dr. J will talk a little bit more about that. But I think we have to have a look and see where some of these relocations are going to move, both in terms of industries, which is shown on the chart on the right, and also in terms of the locations, which I have spoken a bit at length in the prior slides to this. Okay. We think ASEAN is quite well positioned to leverage on some of these supply chain reshuffles. Okay. If you look in terms of the impact on COVID-19 on business operations in Asia-Pac, which is the chart on the left, what has been worst affected obviously has been the travel and hospitality. But the others that are actually benefiting to a certain extent from some of these reshuffle, I would say that we will probably see a step up in terms of manufacturing activity in ASEAN, logistics, healthcare, financial services, basically greater ASEAN intra-ASEAN trade and investments will be key, I think, to riding over this wave of supply chain disruptions. The other point really being that COVID-19 has accelerated digitalization and also e-commerce. Okay, a lot of us now, like I said, work, shop, play all online. Okay, so there are some estimates by some of the consultants on how this market is going to grow rapidly over the coming years. I think online spending in particular across key ASEAN economies will see tremendous growth. Okay, you can see even for Singapore's case during the COVID-19 and the circuit breaker, we had a big spike. For the longest time ever, online shopping as a percentage of retail sales was hovering around the 5%. And because of the circuit breaker, it shot up. And hopefully the new normal will be double digit rather than single digit. So you can see that digital interactions now are twice as important compared to 8 months ago before the COVID crisis. And I think this trend is going to continue. There are many online platforms and e-commerce players and unicorns within Asia that will actually benefit from this growth. Okay, let me conclude my presentation here. Like I said right at the start of my presentation, ASEAN economies have been badly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Growth will take a tremendous hit. The labor market slack that we are starting to see probably will continue to play out in the coming months and quarters. We think until there is effective deployment of vaccine, probably it will not be business as usual anytime soon. It's probably a second half 2021 story, if not 2022 itself. Okay, but that said, some of the big shifts, the mega trends that we see in terms of supply chain diversification and China Plus One strategy, it will actually benefit a well-positioned ASEAN. So I'm not bearish on ASEAN's growth prospects in the coming years. I've listed down here some of the opportunities that some of studies have shown where certain ASEAN countries can benefit. Basically, there is huge and growing demand for infrastructure, for manufacturing, for logistics, for green and environmentally friendly type of industries, and for digitalization and automation. So I'll leave it here, and I'll be happy to take any questions later together with the rest of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Selena, for your very compact analysis and taking us through huge terrain from the impact on the economies of ASEAN, the policy support, and the prospects for growth. May I now call upon Dr. Menon to share his thoughts on positioning ASEAN in global value chains reconfiguration. Over to you, Jay.
Thank you very much, Yean, and good morning to everyone. I've got my slides I'm trying to share right now. This is the second time that I've had to follow Selena in the last few months. And right, okay, so I hope you can see my screen. Yeah.
Yes.
Great, okay. So the next 15 minutes or so, depending on how generous our moderator is feeling today, I want to cover quickly the impact of supply chains, the impact on supply chains in this region. I'll give you a quick overview, and then since this is the ASEAN Roundtable, I'll say a little bit about progress with implementing the ASEAN Economic Community. Then I want to talk about how trade costs, and this links to the AEC, affect global supply chains. Then I want to talk about the elephant in the room, the US-China trade war, how that's changing supply chains in this region, and then I'll quickly draw some conclusions. Okay, so I think the first point to remind ourselves of is how important supply chains are in the world and continue to be. They account for almost half of global trade today, but it's more than just the volumes. The World Bank in their latest World Development Report has shown us how a 1% increase in GSC participation can boost per capita income by much more than 1%. And this is about twice non-GSC trade or conventional trade. I recommend this report for those of you interested in GSCs. It's excellent. And GSEs, of course, is the backbone of ASEAN interdependence, and it drives a lot of ASEAN economic integration. It ties all the original member countries together, but also now increasingly the newest member countries. And it has been a very powerful tool in not just driving growth, but also in increasing incomes, increasing the number of double income households. There's been a huge increase in the number of women participating in the workforce as a result of the growth of GSCs. And so it's also reduced poverty in a lot of the poorer regions within ASEAN. So it's been not just a driver of growth, but a huge developmental driver that has produced tremendous social gains. So with the importance that it plays, what are its prospects going forward? Now, in this chart, which represents the global picture, we can see that after many years of quite strong growth, the GVC or GSC, I use them interchangeably, share of global trade has started to trend downwards, and it started a while ago, right? So I think for this region, the US-China trade war will be the driving force behind changes to GSCs. I think COVID can increase the amount of restructuring and, of course, the pace, but it will not account for all of the disruption or all of the restructuring that Selena very nicely showed us earlier that's taking place, right? It's human nature to attribute all of the disruption that we see to the latest shock or the ones most present in our minds. This is COVID, but COVID is actually more of an accelerator than it is an inducer. And I think this is an important point to always keep in mind. The restructuring in supply chain started much before COVID and even the trade war. Right? It started with rising wages in China, and also after China joined the World Trade Organization, it had to implement a lot of regulations on the environment and so on that in some sense reduced its competitiveness. And so this started happening a long time back, but it's been accelerated more recently. But this reminds us how GSCs are by their very nature forever evolving. They are dynamic beasts. They were born out of disruption and they grow and thrive on disruption. And so this relocation is part and parcel of their lifeblood. Small changes in cost competitiveness can cause shifts, can cause firms to move in and out of countries when they're involved in GSCs. Of course, this will vary by industry, but it doesn't take much for there to be movement in and out. Small changes can do this. And so implementing the core economic agenda, the single windows and so on that Tan Sri Munir, I think, will talk a bit more about later, is critical for supporting GSCs. So for ASEAN, the ASEAN Economic Community agenda will play a very important role and a bigger role during these uncertain times in supporting the growth of GSCs. So how is ASEAN faring in implementing its AEC? We are about at the halfway mark. ASEAN is doing a midterm review. It has another 5 years to go to finalize the AEC implementation. Remember, this is the second deadline that it set. The first one it missed 5 years ago. And how is it going? Well, this chart is drawn from some work that I've done with Ideas Malaysia, where we looked at progress so far as of last year. And you can see that about, ASEAN has implemented about half so far, less than half actually, if you're looking at all the measures that are only partially implemented. And so ASEAN seems to be falling behind its own targets. It's made good progress in many areas, but overall it's sliding behind slightly on its own targets. In this chart here, which focuses more on GSE-related reforms, the picture is also not that great. Again, I don't want to take away from the progress that's being made, but ASEAN is falling behind its own targets, and this is a wake-up call, I think. Of course, it's difficult during difficult times like now, but if ASEAN is to avoid shifting the deadline yet again, it needs to lift its game on implementing the AEC agenda. Right. So as I said, small changes in trade costs can have big impacts on GSE relocation, but a small bilateral tariff can have an even greater amplified effect. So there's no one-to-one relationship between changes in trade costs and changes in bilateral tariffs. And this is where I want to move on to the US-China trade war. The amount of protection that the trade war provides to countries that compete with China for activities that currently take place there is much higher. That level of protection provided to many ASEAN countries that compete with China is much higher than implied by the tariff rate alone. Right. Now, this is an important point that I want to try and spend a bit of time on. I think the gist to understanding this lies in how the tariff that the Trump administration is applying is applied on the total value of the product. But it's only the small share, or it's only the share, which is usually small, that's produced in China that triggers the tariff, right? So if you remove the China share from the production, we remove the tariff applied on 100% of the value. So the intuition is the one bad apple idea. In this example, the bad apple is Chinese value added, right? And that causes the whole bunch to be punished with the tariff. So if you remove China, you remove 100% of the tariff applied on 100% of the value. So we can measure this effective rate of protection that's provided to different ASEAN countries that compete with China for activities that currently take place there. And I want to use one simple formula, and I promise this is the only formula I will use, for what I call the effective rate of spillover protection, right? So the tariff that the US applies, or China retaliates by applying on the US, has to be divided by the value added share. So, for example, if US imposes a 10% tariff on so-called Chinese products, and that so-called Chinese product has 10% of its value coming from China, then the 10% tariff divided by 0.1 becomes 100% tariff, right? So it's magnified 10 times because the value added share is 1/10, right? So this is the amplified effect that bilateral tariffs are having because of global value chains. In the past, goods were produced 100% in one country, the tariff applied to that country. But now we need to take into account that value-added shares are less than 100%. So what is the value-added share on average for Chinese exports to the US? In this table, I've calculated that share for China's exports, so-called Chinese exports to the US for 2018. And the number I want you to focus on at the bottom is that 30.9. So in 2018, on average, only about 31% of value added of so-called Chinese exports to the US was actually produced in China, right? So about 70% of Chinese exports were produced or value added elsewhere other than China. So the next number is 49, right? And that is how much a 15% tariff becomes when the value added share is about 1/3 or 30.9%. If the tariff is 25%, it's inflated about 3 times to become 81%, and so on and so forth. So a 25% tariff is no longer 25, but 81%. So what that means is that costs in competing countries like Vietnam can be up to 81% higher before it makes sense to move those activities out of China to Vietnam. So a 25% gives Vietnam an 81% cost protection or advantage. And I think that's why we have seen so much relocation already taking place because of a relatively small bilateral tariff. They are amplified when global supply chains operate. And there is a lot of evidence. Selena pointed to some. There's lots of micro and macro evidence to suggest that a lot of this is already taking place. A recent FT survey pointed to 70% of firms unlikely to relocate, right? Now, this might seem like there's not much going on, but look at it the other way, 30% are likely to relocate, and that's a large percentage. Of course, we don't expect 100% of firms to relocate because of the trade war, but 30% is a lot. And that's now, right? That's a recent survey. A lot of firms, I think, have already relocated by now, more than 2 years after the trade war started. And there's also macro evidence. We've seen that Vietnam now is probably going to be the best performer in ASEAN in 2020 because of, of course, they've done well in containing the virus, but also they're receiving huge amounts of investment as a result of both COVID and the trade war in the relocation of global supply chains. Malaysia also is benefiting. It started benefiting very early. As I said, restructurings have been happening for a long time now. In the first quarter of 2019, FDI approvals grew by 75%. And by the second quarter, it had already doubled to 12 billion. And most of it was from China and the US. Right. So let me conclude by quickly summarizing the main points. Always remember that GSCs are dynamic creatures and they are always evolving. Reducing trade costs are critical to retaining and expanding GSCs in the ASEAN region. They play a very important role in the development of countries within ASEAN, and the AEC can play a greater role in helping support the growth of GSCs and in attracting more GSC investment as restructurings take place. The US-China trade war is significantly disrupting GSCs and creating a lot of opportunities for ASEAN. And COVID further emphasizes those disruptions and so also those opportunities. But ASEAN must be ready, right? The progress with implementing the ASC is good, but still falling behind its own target. So this is a wake-up call for ASEAN to lift its game as we reach the midway point before the deadline of 2025, and hopefully ASEAN can do so and take advantage of the opportunities that the trade war and COVID presents it with. So with that, let me thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you, Yean, and back to you.
Thank you, Jay, for, as usual, a wonderful explanation on GVCs, its dynamic nature, how the trade war has actually prompted the relocation, which is further accelerated by the COVID. I agree that ASEAN has huge potential in this change in the GVC structure, and that indeed ASEAN must be ready. May I now call upon Tan Sri to present your thoughts on strengthening ASEAN's economic integration. Over to you, Tan Sri.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Tham. And I think, of course, also to ISAS asked me to take a stab at this subject of strengthening ASEAN's economic integration. The first two presentations very nicely put in context, what I might have to say, particularly Dr. Jayant's earlier on, the last one, about ASEAN strengthening, itself and being ready for the advantage. The problem with ASEAN is that the headline numbers, and some of them were shown by Dr. Selena earlier on, are excellent. Even under these COVID circumstances, ASEAN now talks of itself as being a $3.2 trillion economy. That's fifth largest in the world. It talks of itself as becoming the fourth largest by 2028 now, 2030. And it talks of itself as attracting a huge amount of investment. And last year, 2019, it was over 160 billion. And it talks indeed about a rate of growth which has been quite extraordinary in the last decade or so, actually, a rate of growth that has averaged about 5.5%. And this year, with the first decline in 22 years in ASEAN growth. So there's a great growth story, big numbers, investments coming in, and therefore there is a tendency to be saying, I'm all right, Jack, okay, we're doing okay. Of course, COVID has jerked ASEAN into the challenges that it faces, but not jerked it enough. Now, what I am going to do today is to identify, in three areas where ASEAN needs to up its game and not just go by the headline numbers and not just go by a approximate achievement of objectives, three areas where it should do so. And then I would also look at one particular area where it's talked about a lot in ASEAN, the fourth industrial revolution, how it's going to propel greater ASEAN growth. In fact, lots of studies by various consulting firms have shown an extra US 1 trillion addition by 2025 from adoption of 4IR. Again, you know, the conditions are not always addressed by ASEAN. ASEAN's attracted to and advertises just the headline numbers. Now, if I'm in the second slide, in my next slide, I say there is no silver bullet, you know, in terms of how to strengthen the AEC. There are many things that you have to do. Some have been sort of highlighted in terms of trade facilitation, trade integration. And then, as I said, I will be highlighting this along with two other factors. And I will also be examining whether or not the industrial revolution, I mean, the fourth IR, I mean, digitalization will give this push to ASEAN moving forward, will integrate ASEAN further or not. So there is no silver bullet, but I will like to propose that there is an answer which I will come to at the end on my 11th slide, which involves really looking at the way ASEAN operates, the way ASEAN works, the way ASEAN functions. And therefore, I would spend a lot more time on my 11th final slide than on the slides in between, many of which are well-known factors that hold back ASEAN integration. The first of which, if we look at investment in the next slide, the route to, as I said, to single market and production base, and this is actually stated in Article 1.5 of the ASEAN Charter. You know, that was in 2007. Apart from all the blueprints and so on, in the ASEAN Charter itself, that was signed actually in Singapore in 2007. And so it is not something which is an amorphous thing. It is something that is committed, which ASEAN must do and achieve, and says it will achieve when it announced the ASEAN Economic Community here in Malaysia in 2015. But there's so many conditions to achieve that market and to achieve the ASEAN growth, and you know, the three main conditions are you know, to remove all and non-tariff barriers, and it's one of the things I'll be looking at later in a little bit of detail. The other one is to double you know, the trade between ASEAN countries, and the third one is to remove half, you know, of those non-tariff barriers, to have trade facilitation through the ASEAN single window and other means to reduce the cost of doing trade within ASEAN by 10% by 2025. And of course, investment will come in. Let's look at the next slide and look at investment, which is always talked about as a strong push factor. It's talked about in terms of relocation. It was underlined by the presentation by Dr. Jayant earlier on. But one point that we must note, in this COVID environment overall, the ASEAN Secretariat itself sees investment coming down, and the numbers for investment numbers is negative for the first quarter of 2020. And we also must look at the distribution of the investment. And you will see there that Singapore gets as much as 52% of the investment over the last 10 years or so. And that continues to be the case. And so the distribution of the investment, meaning, where it comes. Of course, we now have the relocation that's taking place. The numbers were mentioned earlier on in Vietnam or Malaysia. Again, there is not huge distribution in ASEAN of such relocated investments, even if they occur now from China to surmount higher costs in China, the trade war with the US, or the trade war the US has imposed on China. And therefore, also you have to look at the infrastructure that's available in the host ASEAN country, and the infrastructure now increasingly requires good human capital. And therefore, countries that do not have these facilities, these capabilities, will not attract necessarily those investments, and ASEAN, well, the ASEAN aggregate numbers will look good in terms of investment. What about the whole of ASEAN? How is investment going to be redistributed or going to come to other countries which are not as developed as the ASEAN 6 and so on? So we must bear in mind that the relocation picks and chooses where it comes insofar as investment is concerned. And also a point that was made earlier by Dr. Jayant is well worth reflecting on. And I would add an additional point that investment has become very mobile in this world. And so there are factors that are driving sort of relocation and investment, which may not necessarily leave ASEAN as the FDI area of choice, which ASEAN is, but it will not always remain so if ASEAN does not develop its infrastructure, human capital capabilities, as well as the trading capabilities with the rest of the region. And therefore, this is very important for us not to be not to be too complacent about the investments that ASEAN has been able to attract, both on the various points I've mentioned, distribution of it, capability to use the investment, mobility of investment, nearshoring that is taking place, and strategic protectionism that may occur, which has been talked about in the EU quite a bit. So that's investment. Now we go to ASEAN single window in the next slide. You will see that this project has been going on since 2005, and it's deemed to have been completed, but I would say it is incomplete, because what we have under the ASEAN single window is we have only one transmission of this Form D in the certificate of origin between ASEAN member states that's taking place through the ASEAN single window. There are many other things that should take place on this platform. There's no fully automated customs clearance procedures. There's no fully electronic payment system for duties and taxes. So we cannot say, we have completed the job on the ASEAN single window, which is one of the means of facilitating trade, unless we do other things beyond the single item that has been achieved. It's taken a very long time too to come to that point, but it's only one single item, and therefore we must understand that there's a long way to go still insofar as the ASEAN single window is concerned. And if you look at the next slide, you will see the next item that I wish to underline is on the non-tariff measures and non-tariff barriers. You will see that actually between 2015, when the ASEAN Economic Community was set up, and 2020, there has been a 60% rise in non-tariff barriers, non-tariff measures. And I think this is not good. This is not the way that ASEAN was supposed to go with the community. So what's happening here And we've, in the business sector, been pushing, exactly what's happening. And you see sort of Vietnam and Thailand, in the lead there since 2015 in terms of the non-tariff measures that they have introduced. And I think this is not good news, and something that has to be done. I understand the Hanoi Plan of Action earlier this year in terms of addressing COVID-19 had referred to, a stop to unnecessary NTMs. But we in the business sector have asked for a complete restriction on all NTMs. I think there might be an MOU that will happen in November on NTMs, but it will not be internationally, not enforceable by international law. So let's move on to the next slide, and we will see the kinds of measures that are in place. We can have questions on this. I'm running a bit out of time, but we can see how 2/3 are NTMs in the NTB, the whole NTB book. But some of the TBT measures and the SPS measures are actually also non-tariff barriers that are put in. They can be addressed. These things on sanitary and photosanitary steps to protect food, medicines, and so on. They should be transparent, and they should be MRAs. They should be harmonized in ASEAN, and there should be mutual recognition agreements on them, so that they will not be sort of hidden or actually proxies for actually non-tariff barriers. Now, I'd like to move on now to the next slide, which talks about, this great thing that's going to propel ASEAN ahead. It would do. AI alone will be a huge boost for ASEAN. Again, look at ASEAN countries being at different stages of development insofar as 4IR readiness is concerned. And the slide after this will show also, how the impact of 4IR will be on jobs. 28 million jobs will be replaced. How much of reskilling and upskilling is there going to be done? And there's a lot of work to be done to make 4IR succeed in terms of having e-fit and technically trained people as well on the other side of it, and in terms of retraining and reskilling of displaced people on the other side. Now, on slide 10 now, the next slide, you will see a large number of ASEAN workers who need reskilling. You can have a look at these in terms of the kinds of skills that are needed for the reskilling process to take place effectively, and therefore to boost this greater ASEAN growth. Now, finally, I want to come to slide 11 because time is running out. I'm sorry. Now, we have put forward with COVID-19 225 steps that need to be taken to make sure that ASEAN, in the first place, protects lives, in the second place, reopens economy, and in the third place, restarts recovery. So this is a very thorough thing put together by all the ASEAN business councils around the world: US, UK, EU, ASEAN Business Advisory Council for ASEAN. And this is the most comprehensive thing that we have done. And it is very important that these steps are taken. And it is also very important in one of our proposals that ASEAN makes decisions faster, that ASEAN does not keep pushing paper around through the various processes, the various working groups that it has. It has to actually focus on decision making. And we have proposed that an ASEAN high-level special commission be established as a kind of exco to the ASEAN leaders. ASEAN leaders are the highest level of decision making, but they only meet ordinarily twice a year. And they usually are fed ideas which are generalized, framework ideas, ideas which relate to one that will come in the November summit on the economic recovery framework, which is necessary, but not complete. It is not complete because you must give meat and blood within that framework for action to be taken. And we are proposing that our proposals may sound like a wish list 225, but actually they're very interrelated, very, very interrelated. I do not have time to go through these proposals because, as I said, time is running out. But ASEAN must work in a different way. It must make decisions faster. It must not give the appearance of having a network governance system when the networking is not working. When there are meetings that take place are very scripted, and there's no discussion about the real substance, about what needs to be done. So this pathway 225 shows what needs to be done, but it needs to be decided upon by governments in terms of giving flesh to what needs to be done, prioritizing it, and implementing it. ASEAN needs to move faster, and one way to strengthen and further its economic integration process is to change the way it works and the way it comes to make decisions. Okay, thank you. I've gone over 15 minutes a bit.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri, for your in-depth analysis on the problems with ASEAN, the unevenness in terms of distribution of foreign direct investment, as well as the readiness to embrace above IR.